Okay, so we are at 10:30, so let's get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the very last session, Migration and its Effects. You may or may not have seen from the errata that there's been a change in schedule, so we're just going to have two papers in this session. First, we'll have Vasily Rusanov presenting. That'll be discussed by Andreas Ferrara, and then Alexander Persaud will present, and I will discuss that. So we've got a little bit more time in the session, given that we only have two papers. I've given the authors up to 25 minutes to present, and then discussants will have up to 10 minutes. But if we don't use up all of that time, I think that will be no problem at all. So without any further ado, Vasily, please take it away. You should be all set up.
All right. I should take my mask off. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm a PhD candidate at NYU. I'm currently on the job market. This is my job market paper. So I'm going to tell you about internal migration and the diffusion of schooling in the US in the 19th century. By the second half of the 19th century, the United States became the most educated country in the world, overtaking countries like Norway, Sweden, and Prussia. This is primary education, so think about children aged 7 to 14. As I will show in a second, despite this overall very high average school enrollment, there was a great degree of inequality both between and within states in terms of how many children actually went to school. At the same time, the country was experiencing massive movements of population inside. People were moving from state to state a lot. About 40% of whites did not live in their state of birth in the second half of the 19th century, and that share remained fairly constant across that period. And this paper is basically about, are these two facts related? Are high school enrollment rates on the one hand and the high internal migration in the country on the other hand connected to each other? Here's a quote from a historian discussing this period. This is from a book about the history of education in Wisconsin. Perhaps the chief explanation of the general acceptance of the free school idea in early Wisconsin, the fact that many of the settlers had witnessed its operation in the East and were convinced of its soundness. This is by no means the main thesis of the book I'm quoting this from, but this idea that migrants kind of shape the places where they moved has been discussed in the literature before. To motivate things further, here's a comparison between internal migration rates of several countries for which I could find the data. You can see that the US clearly stands out in terms of how many people moved. So here for each country, you can see the share of people who did not live in their state or department or province or county of birth for different countries. I think that the best comparison here is between the US and Russia because the size of the locations, the size of the American states and the Russian provinces is kind of comparable. French departments are somewhat small, that might explain the higher share. Another interesting thing about this table is the comparison between the migration rates for the whites in the 19th century and the event that I know some people in the audience have studied, the Great Migration of the blacks from the south to the north. You can see that actually in the 19th century, the whites were even more mobile than the blacks in the 20th century. All right, so the question of this paper is how important was internal migration for the spread of primary education? You can think about this from two kind of angles. The first angle is, migrants create connections between places. People move, and that makes some places more connected to other places than for some other pairs. And I'm interested in how these connections help the diffusion of a new idea across space. Mass schooling, the idea that every child should go through some formal education, was probably the most important social and economic innovation of the 19th century. And I'm interested in how internal migration helped to spread this innovation across places. And the second angle to look at this is through inequality. You can think about two counties. One county receives migrants from very educated places. Another country receives migrants from less educated places. And it's interesting to what extent this causes inequality between the two. So what do I do? The first part of the paper is about the estimation of the spillover effects from migrants onto the natives. So I construct a panel of counties where I have the school enrollments, and I also have a changing composition of internal migrants who come from different states. This is all before compulsory schooling. So at this time, people are free to choose whether to send their child to school or not. which I think makes this spillover effect more interesting. To deal with the selection of migrants, the idea that maybe if you're from Massachusetts, a very educated state, you will want to go to a place that has good schools or is otherwise useful or is otherwise nice for education. This selection can cause issues in estimation. So to tackle this, I construct a simulated network of internal migration, which relies on the similarity in potential yields between origins and destinations. So I take 3 crops that were commonly grown at the time, corn, wheat, and potatoes, and I construct similarity measures across space, and I construct the simulated network based on those measures. And the second part, I compare the preferences of the internal migrants themselves. Rather than looking at the spillovers on the natives, I look at the migrants. And I construct a choice model where people choose first where to live, and second, whether they want to enroll their child in school in the destination. And then, of course, they make a backward induction, taking the second stage into account. All right. I will skip the literature review for the sake of time, and I will just go straight into my setup and data. This is a typical school in the period that I studied. So this is a 1-room schoolhouse with the teacher in the front. Usually it's a single female teacher who teaches kids of all ages. You can see that there are very young kids and there are teenagers in the background. The curriculum consisted of the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, for the younger kids. And for the older kids, it included things like geography, history, basic natural sciences. As I said, no compulsory schooling laws. This photo was taken in 1875. Wisconsin adopted the first compulsory schooling law in 1879, and also very localized management of schools. So this school was funded through the very local property taxes, which kind of motivates me to use county level estimates for everything. All right, the data comes from the population census. I have 421 standardized counties using the Hornbeck procedure. In 7 states that are roughly located along the Mississippi River. You can see the list there. I should probably move this just a bit. I rely on 2 questions in the population census. The first question is origin. The census asked everybody, what state were you born in, which is what I use as the measure of migration. So migrants are people who were not born in the place where they are. And the second question is on enrollments. The census asked everybody under the age 20, did you go to school in the last year, at least for a day, which is my measure of enrollments. Arguably, it's pretty lax, just 1 day is enough. The instructions explicitly exclude Sunday schools, but any kind of formal education was counted. And the census was also conducted on the same day every year in the period that I have. The census is every 10 years from 1850 to 1880, so I have 4 time periods, and it's always June 1st when the question is asked. I augment the widely known population census with the census of social statistics, which was collected by the same marshals who collected the population census, but somehow escaped the digitization efforts of economic historians. So what I do is I collect the schedules of the Census of Social Statistics, which gives me this very rich data set on school funding, teachers, students, and other things not related to education, such as wages. This is an example of the Census of Social Statistics schedule. This is from Bad Axe County, Wisconsin, which they renamed the next year after the census was conducted. And the section that is of interest for me is here on the right. You see that there is a description of local colleges, academies, and schools. There is the description of the type of schools, and for each type, I know how it was funded. So the funding sources are from endowment, taxation, from public funds, and from other sources, which I learned meant tuition. For this county, things are pretty straightforward. There are 98 common schools, and they did not charge any tuition. That's why in this column you have nothing. They only relied on taxes. And there are a bunch of private schools that charge tuition. However, it is not always the case that things are so straightforward, and the distinction between public and private schools is complicated. That's why I rely on the measures of funding rather than the classification of schools from the type over here. So rather than taking the share of private versus public schools, for example, I look at the private funding and public funding in what will come. I will be very happy to talk about what else is available in the Census of Social Statistics, but because the crowd might be interested. This is what the outcome variable looks like. So this is the school enrollment across the 7 states in my destination sample. At the county level, you can see that there is a lot of variation going on here. So looking at those counties in Iowa, for example, you can see that there are places that have close to 100% school enrollments for native children, while some counties next to them have fewer than 40% of kids going to school. Now, those school enrollments are for the native children, which once again I define as those children whose mother is born in the state where they live. And you can see that there are also 22 origin states. I aggregated things to the state level to reflect that my measure of origin is at the state level. And you can see that there is a lot of north-south variation in terms of the school enrollments, which I leverage, and I look at how people coming from those different states with different school enrollments affected the natives in the receiving states. All right, now let me tell you about what estimation exercise I'm running. So I think about migrants who move from a certain origin state to a destination county. And on the left-hand side, I'm going to have the school enrollment for the native kids that you just saw in the map. On the right-hand side, the key explanatory variable is going to be this weighted average. In the weighted average, I have the weighted average of the school enrollments in the origins of internal migrants. So take the people from Massachusetts. They have 90% school enrollments for the natives in Massachusetts, and look at what's the percentage of people from Massachusetts amongst the population in the destination county. For example, it could be 5%. So I multiply each sending state's enrollment rate by the weight, and then I collect the weighted average, which you can think of as like the quality of internal migrants. And this coefficient beta m here reflects the spillover effects of the internal migrants onto the natives. Importantly, I include county and year fixed effects in all the specifications to take into account, for example, the initial shares of education. So the comparison happens within the county, and I leverage the fact that the composition of the migrants changes across time. This is what the raw data looks like. I would have a very similar picture if I residualized it, but I decided to just plot the raw data. So on the y-axis, I have the school enrollment of the natives. And on the x-axis, I have this weighted average of the school enrollments in the origins of the internal migrants. You can see there is a very strong positive correlation here. Places that receive migrants from more educated states are going to have higher school enrollments for the natives in those places. There is obviously a lot of state fixed effects going on. Arkansas, the black dots, they received migrants from relatively less educated states and also had low school enrollments for their natives. Michigan received very educated migrants and also had high school enrollment rates for the natives. And the most interesting two states are really Missouri and Illinois, which had a very diverse set of people who were moving there, perhaps due to the central location of those states. Now, a concern related to causal interpretation of the figure I just showed you is, of course, selection of migrants. What if people from Massachusetts who really cared about education decided to move to places that had, for example, good schools? To tackle this issue, I construct, rather than the actual average of the school enrollments and the origins of migrants, I construct the average school enrollment of the predicted migrants, where the prediction relies on the similarity in potential yields between the destinations and the origins. The idea behind this instrument is that most of the internal migrants in the sample are farmers. They grow crops and they want to move to a place that is similar to their origin in terms of what they should be growing. If you're a corn farmer, you want to move to a place that should grow corn. So the specific measure I construct is the similarity in comparative advantage. So for each location, I calculate the ratio between suitabilities for the 3 crops that I use, and I calculate the absolute difference in those ratios. And the interpretation is I have the similarity in the comparative advantage, predicting the stocks of migrants. So if you come from a place that specializes in corn because corn to potato ratio is high, you will choose to go to a place where the corn to potato ratio is high. The data comes from FAO. It is, I have to say, modern data. It's from the sample from 1960 to 1990. Although FAO does provide the opportunity to select intermediate inputs, which is very important because of the differences in agricultural practices between today and the 19th century. For the reason of, because I use this IV, I exclude large cities from the sample and I only rely on the rural counties. All right, so to sum up the estimation, I'm going to have 3 stages from 0 to 2. So 0 stage is the construction of those predicted stocks of migrants in different places. And the prediction relies on this dissimilarity measure that I mentioned earlier. And then I'm going to run the standard 2 SLS regression, where I use the education at home of the predicted migrants as the instrument for the actual education at the home of migrants. This is what the ID looks like. So here is the image of the suitability for corn relatively to potatoes. You can see that within the receiving states, there is not just a simple south to north divide going on. So you can see those bands. For example, here in northern Missouri, the corn to potato ratio is higher than in the southern Missouri. This area is known as Little Dixie, and this is a place where a lot of southerners moved, arguably because they wanted to grow the same crops as they were growing in the south. And southern Missouri was not actually as suitable for that as the northern Missouri. Same map for the wheat to potato ratios. And let me jump into the results. So to put a simple number on the results, if you hypothetically change the origins in a county of internal migrants from Louisiana, which was the least educated state in 1880, to Massachusetts, the most educated state, that would increase the local school enrollment by 28.4 percentage points, which is a very sizable effect. This is, of course, a very hypothetical example because no county in my sample received received people from a unique sending state. There was a good mix of things going on. Now, here is the regression table. I put both the OLS and the ID results. The explanatory variable, once again, is the school enrollments in the destination counties. The outcome variable. And the magnitude, if you look at column 3, that's my preferred specification. The magnitude is if you receive migrants from places that have 1 percentage point higher school enrollments, the school enrollments in the destination will go up by 0.55 percentage points. I also use latitude and longitude polynomials. I use a geographic IV, so it's important to attempt to flexibly control for geography. You can see that the coefficient actually pushes up, but so does the standard error in both cases whenever I run OLS or IV. One other thing that I would like to mention is you may have a question of, is this the spillover effect from, for example, only farmers to only other farmers and not non-farmers? I do run the same regression with the children of non-farmers as the outcome, and I find very similar coefficients in magnitude. All right, now to kind of allude to what the mechanism was. The Census of Social Statistics that I digitize allows me to look at the school funding. So what I do is I put on the left-hand side, rather than the school enrollments, I put the funding of schools, which could either be private or public. And I find that 1 percentage point increase in school enrollments in the homes of internal migrants increases the public spending on schools on 29 cents. And there is no effect on private spending. From the work of Peter Lindert, we know that public spending was an important driver of school enrollments in the 19th century. And you can see that in this story, it definitely looks like it mattered, since there is a significant increase of 29 cents per child in terms of the expenditures on students. 29 cents is roughly 10% of what it cost to educate children in places where there was no public spending on schools. All right, now in the last 5 minutes that I have, I would like to talk a little bit about the choice of migrants. So all of the results I've shown you before rely on the school enrollments of the natives in the destination of migrants. Instead of that, now I'm going to look at the school enrollments of the migrants themselves. I'm going to compare the choices made by people from different states. The way to think about this is it true that people from Massachusetts are more likely to send their children to school compared to people from, say, Louisiana? So I impose some structure to elicit the preferences for schools and locations. Simply comparing the average school enrollments would be misleading because of selection. If people from Massachusetts go to places with good schools, you cannot just say that their school enrollment was higher because of the higher preference for schools. Maybe because they moved to places with cheap schools, the school enrollment was higher, and if they were to be put in a place with expensive schools, they would actually not send their children to school. I also want to have a counterfactual relying on the question of what if the US had migration rates of Europe, but this is work in progress, and unfortunately I won't be able to give you those results today. So the way that I estimate the choice model is I construct a multinomial logit, which has some value of going to a certain place, a certain location, and also sending your child to school or not. So I assume perfect foresight. I assume that parents know where they're going to go, what the prices are going to be, and all the local characteristics that they care about. I also allow the utility from school to vary by all sorts of demographic characteristics available from the census, such as age, family wealth, sex of the child, etc. So this is what the model looks like graphically. So people make two decisions. They first make a decision of whether to stay or to leave. So I allow the people from the 22 origin states to stay in their home state. And then they choose whether they want to send their child in school or no. And if they do send their child to school, they receive utility from schooling, this part over here, which is this fixed effect of going to school, and also different, and also the effect of different characteristics of the child that they have. But they have to pay the price. If they don't send their child to school, they only get the coefficient on staying home, because as we know, people tend to stay home a lot. So I allow the model to flexibly have this like just home effect. And then if they choose to leave, they can go to either the 420 counties in my 7 western states, or they might choose to go to one of the other 22 origin states minus the home state. And there they again make the same decision, except they also have to pay the cost of moving. So if you move from a certain state to a certain county, you have to pay the cost of the dissimilarity in crops that you grow, and also distance. All right. So the model I estimate for each of the origin states separately. So if you have any concerns about like, what if people from Massachusetts had a higher propensity to leave, that the model takes into account. The key thing that I want to show from the, the key thing that I want to show from the model is the willingness to pay. So from the Census of Social Statistics, I obtain the price, which I calculate as the total private spending divided by the number of students. And I calculate the willingness to pay as the price at which you would be indifferent between sending your child to school or not. So this is my measure of the preference for education. I find that this price, why is this? Oh, yeah. I find that this willingness to pay it correlates strongly with the school enrollments in the sending states in the first year in my sample. So here on the y-axis, you have this estimated willingness to pay for sending children to school. And here you have, on the x-axis, you have the school enrollments of natives in this sending state. For some states, I estimate that the willingness to pay is negative, which I interpret as you would rather have your child work, helping with the stuff on the farm, because the sample only includes farmers, rather than have children enrolled in a school. All right, I think I should conclude now. So the two results that I have are that natives are affected by the internal migrants who choose to move to where they live. So there is this spillover effect from the kinds of people who decide to live in your location onto the natives. A second result is that there is a significant persistence of preferences based on the place of birth. So people's preferences for education are shaped by where they come from. And the general takeaway that, the big picture story that I would like you to have from this is that internal migration matters beyond labor reallocation and just sorting of preferences. Because of this spillover effect, there is this important function of the internal migration, creating some kind of a network that allows the spread of new ideas and technologies in this paper, education. I think I will stop here. Thank you very much for coming, and I'm looking forward to Andy's comments and also the questions. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you so much for having me and for the opportunity to discuss this excellent paper by Vasily. Just want to reiterate that he is on the market. He is one of Petra Mosa's fantastic graduate students. So if you're hiring this year, you should definitely have a look at his profile. Let me briefly recap what this paper is about. So the big question is, how did internal migration spread education across the newly settled states in the US in the 19th century? And what were the spillover effects that this had to natives in these states? And the big findings that come out of this paper are that the children were more likely to be enrolled in school if their parents came from more educated states, right? So this is conditional on wealth, family characteristics, and parental occupations. And then something that comes a lot earlier in the paper than what it did in the presentation was the structural model for the willingness to pay for education for these kids by migrants, where they come from, and the associated geographic variation with this. And then the really interesting part here is the spillovers part to people in the receiving countries, states and counties, where Vasily has collected really interesting new data on public school funding and enrollment. And the interesting part here is that this increase in school spending associated with these internal migrants outpaces the increase in enrollment. So these places not just enroll more students, they also spend comparatively more on these kids. And then Vasily has this identification strategy based on crop suitability between the sending and receiving areas to establish causality in this relationship. So what I thought was that, first of all, this paper is very well written. And again, this is Vasily's job market paper. And it's a very exciting period of time for US economic history. And I was supposed to say 1850 to 1880, which is a slightly longer period. And it's also a period that sees a lot of action in this country. So you have these newly settled states that differ in their frontier experience. So this is something that Vasily and his co-authors are studying, which has all sorts of impacts on social capital that again relates to the demand for education. We have the Civil War at this period, which might potentially be important because a lot of the, especially Union Army soldiers, eventually get paid in land via the Homestead Act. And a lot of soldiers are also coming from other countries with different educational institutions, in particular Germans. Think of Prussians, who already at the time have a very developed schooling system. And so this is something that they might have brought with them to these areas. And then also there's a paper by Nicholas Leo Bustos who shows that the Homestead Act, or homesteading in general, generated a middle class that subsequently had a higher demand for education. So these are some of the things in the historical background that should probably be discussed a little bit more, because let me re-emphasize, this paper is very well written. It's got a lot of impressive data work. But you heard Martha Olli say yesterday, you also need the history. And so these are some things that are important and that should be discussed a little bit more. The same goes for the waves of foreign migration, right? So at this time, you get a lot of Germans, a lot of Irish settlers, and then yeah, those are the big groups at the time. I know you control for these guys, but they should receive a little bit more attention also in the empirical setting. So we just don't want to stuck them in the controls and then fire and forget. You also want to contrast this a little bit simply because they also bring their own institutions, and some of them also come from the sending states with high levels of enrollment and educational quality, and also plays into the different type of religions that spread across the United States with these migrants. So think about the difference between Protestants and Catholics who have different institutions for education as well. And so these are some things that you might want to consider a little bit more. Now, the structural model that came at the very end, I know you want to have this for the job market paper, show off some skills, but honestly, I was ready to believe that people from these high education quality sending states were more willing to pay for this. So it's also not super surprising that in states with low willingness to pay for education, you also see less enrollment and vice versa. So personally, I like the structure of the presentation much more than in the paper, so I would probably put this further in the back, if at all, because the economic historians will probably tell you, why did you need this complicated model to show something this intuitive? Whereas the IO economists will probably tell you, do something more with better data, and you know the IO people well, so I'll leave it at that. Now, the instrument is interesting. I had one issue with the claim that is so different from the chain migration argument. So in the migration and labor literature is what people use a lot because they're not too different from each other conceptually, right? So people go to places where they know how to do agriculture, and then subsequently people go to those very same places, right? So they're somewhat interrelated. And also at this time, people tend to move mostly from the east to the west rather than from north to south or vice versa. So somebody from Massachusetts tends to be much more likely to end up in Wisconsin rather than in Arkansas. And so probably this is also something that you see in the patterns in the maps. That's something that you might want to discuss a little bit more. Now, for the instrument itself, I'm always a fan of strong first stages. But when the F statistic is over 1,000, that is surprising. And when I looked at the graphs here, the actual share of migrants over the predicted share of migrants, it looks almost like a deterministic function. Like that might be like a sigmoid function. When you use the chain migration argument or the chain migration IV, that's almost perfectly linear. So that might raise some eyebrows. And in particular, when you start to control for the year fixed effect interaction with the latitude and longitude, F statistic drops from 1,000 to 38, and then the IV coefficient doubles. And people will definitely ask you questions about this. One thing, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, that might help with this is to also characterize a little bit more what these migrants are doing. Are they agricultural workers to begin with? Do they do something else afterwards? They might even consider to do an actual shift share IV, what the labor folk would do in these kinds of settings. And then also related to this, as to what people are doing, what do these migrants bring to these new places? Are they just people with a higher demand for schooling and better schooling, or do they actually also bring these institutions? And here's also something that you could see potentially in the census, like what do they do? Do they become teachers, headmasters? Are they relatively more involved in schooling directly? And yesterday we already discussed the supply versus demand question. So I will just leave it at that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Vasily, for a great presentation, and Andy for a great discussion. What I think I'd like to do is to gather as many questions as we have, and then we'll give Vasily some time to respond to those. So if you have questions, we'll start with folks in the room. Please just step up to the microphone and speak loudly so that folks on Zoom can hear you. And then folks on Zoom will come to you next. So please go ahead. Yeah, Yane.
So I guess my comment I think that the administration are does one of the first promises is to make the connection between the different races. So they show is the distribution of program immigration is to create the significant protection from the other. States are going to people from the south and from others. The prediction is there's been a reduction in the carbon. And the reduction shows that there's still not higher rate and higher rate. Okay. Might be able to explain why we don't see regression in this program. We cannot explain that why there's higher rate. And the second part is really how the teach. The open solution related to that is there is regression goes along going back. So finding that and that's something the brain is very and using the rock similarity is actually control. So it's just brain is in this way. And this is also shows that the equations are cross similarities. So to be sure, you're also aware of that, you're trying that often with that, right? But the thing is important, you can see that nothing of that. Or more widely,
Thank you. Elise, please. Okay, thank you. Flor, did you want to go?
Okay, so that was a really neat paper. My question was more about so in terms of like pinning down the particular mechanism, whether it's like the kind of diffusion of these preferences, or whether it could at least to some extent be kind of labor market competition, or kind of like anticipating the kind of competitive pressures that you're facing from the new migrants. And I wonder if you could take advantage of in any given prospect in that cycle labor market or the prospective labor market, if you think about like the age composition of people that are coming in and what occupations their parents have, and maybe if you slice it, kind of people who we would expect among natives and recent migrants to be in direct or expect their children to be potentially in direct competition with them based on parents' occupations. Like, do you see kind of some sort of like educational arms race happening? Like, is it the parents are kind of observing the changing composition of the population and trying to prepare their children? And I don't know if you'd really call that, preference diffusion, but it's something related to that.
Thank you very much. And do we have any more? Let me check with the Zoom crowd really quick. Any folks on Zoom that have any questions or comments they'd like to offer? Yeah, Andrew, please.
Do you have any indication from your data whether one mechanism by which this effect is coming about is by changing the availability of schooling? So, for example, if you have migrants from Massachusetts, which has a long history of public schooling, do you then have a greater political demand for local public schooling and more schools are built? So the availability of free schooling in that area is increased as a result of the migrants.
Thank you very much. And in the interest of time, let me give Vasily a few minutes here. You have a lot of great questions and comments, so just respond to whatever you like.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the excellent discussion and a lot of very relatable comments and questions, because I did have a lot of there's something that I thought about. I want to start with the instrument. So Andy mentioned the F-stat being over 1,000. It's over 1,000 that use the past migration predicts future migration instrument, which is exactly what motivated me to look at the, some more economically motivated aspect of migration, which I thought would be farming. So when I made those plots where you can see that the past migrants basically perfectly predict the future migrants, it's just a linear correlation and it's very strong. I thought that I need to use something that will not give me a perfect correlation, because if your IV perfectly predicts the explanatory variable, then why are you using the IV in the first place? Another comment on, so the comment on the, how I motivate the things by what if the US had lower migration rate, but then I don't really give you a sense of the number. So the answer to the question of what would have happened to the US if the internal migration rate was lower depends on how you think about why it would be lower. Why would the migration be lower? The way I like to think about this is, what if we simply increase the cost of moving of people between places? You can think about either just transportation costs, like what if the US constructed less railroads at the period, or you could think about some administrative barriers to migration. And I think that the key thing here is looking at how the origin people from the states in the East would respond differentially to those changing costs. And that is where the model is kind of going. I want to introduce some tension that would differentially impact people from Massachusetts as opposed to people from Alabama. Basically, you can think about it this way. What if you had a hypothetical institutional barrier which is equivalent to some payment that you have to make to move? People would respond differently because people did have different preferences for moving to a new state from those origins. That's where this is going. Now, Claudia Golden's work on Iowa on the 1915 census is excellent. It's a somewhat later period, although, of course, we know that it's easier to do public spending when the population is more homogeneous. I didn't actually find, anecdotally from the historian's work, I didn't find any descriptions of tensions from people between people coming from the north and the south in terms of, we don't trust the southerners, so we are not going to raise the taxes, or we don't want our northern money to be spent on the southerners. It is definitely an important concern when you talk about foreigners. There is this very interesting paper about how compulsory schooling introduced after my period of study was a response to increasing influxes of foreigners. I need to think more about how exactly I would frame what I'm doing and explain what the role of the foreigners is. That's for sure. And speaking of the occupation composition of the migrants, so half of them are just recorded as farmers, just plain farmers and farm laborers. Other people are recorded in different occupations. It's hard for me to say like how those occupations are, how far they are from farming, because even if they are working in manufacturing, the manufacturing is often connected to agriculture. Like they could be working on some machinery that was also rapidly being introduced, as we know, during that time. Yeah, and I think I'll just stop here, and I will try to talk to people who ask questions individually, because it's definitely a conversation that I want to have. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Okay, and so moving on to our second paper, we have Alexander Persaud, who's going to be presenting about the British Empire's money borders. So, Alexander, take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Brian. I'm just going to share my screen here. Hopefully everybody can see this. Excellent. Right. So thank you, everybody, for sticking around. I know this is the last session of, the last paper of the last session of the entire conference. So thank you very much. As Brian said, I will be talking about money orders, and the title of my paper is "The Sun Never Sets on the British Empire's Money Orders, Trinidad to India Remittances in the 1880s." The motivation behind this, shifting to another part of the Americas from the United States, from Vasily's paper just now, is to Trinidad, which has a large Indian migration. And when we think about India, we often think about caste. So caste or jati, which are more like subcaste networks, have not been studied very much historically. But what we do know is that caste affects migration and, by extension, remittances. So there's a lot of modern research on this to say that caste does have this mediating effect, or in fact, does have this causal effect on both of these. That's the one side from caste. The other side, when we think about migration, is something like remittances. So historical remittances have rarely been studied with micro-level data, and I now actually have a context where I can think about this. So I have caste networks outside of India, and then remittances. The overarching question I'm going to ask here is, which overseas caste or castes maintain the strongest connections to India? So if we think about people leaving India in the 19th century, it's very difficult to go back. It's very difficult to make connections, although, as we'll see, these are somewhat reduced when you move within the British Empire. And one way we can think about the connections between a caste across space and time is whether or not members of that caste send money back to India. There's a lot of research on caste migration, as I just said, so I'll skip over this. Very quickly on remittances, here are two examples of historical remittances. So McGee and Thompson talking about aggregate flows of remittances from British migrants around the world to British colonies as well as to the United States. And then Esteves and Kudur Casteras talking about how European migrants' remittances can actually smooth financial stability. They show this using remittance data prior to the First World War in Central Europe. So my approach here is to take a context in which the cost to migrate are reduced. So if we think about one reason why somebody might send back a remittance, it could be to pay the debt of a migration cost. So here, there's no need to pay back that cost. There's no need to remit money to pay back a migration cost. I'm also taking a context in which wages are relatively high and uniform, and all workers can therefore theoretically send back remittances. So if I'm worried about selection, like people selecting into higher paying occupations, I might worry that my remittance data might be biased. Here, the context and the institutional rules around this are actually going to prevent that from happening, which levels the playing field for people across caste. I'm going to examine selection, the amounts, and the timing of remittances. And by extension, I can look at long-run remittances. So do people send money right away, or do they send money repeatedly over time? I'm looking at the context of Indian indentureship, which began in 1838 and ended in 1917. So if you've seen my work before or seen other work on indentureship, you may be familiar with it. It's very different than, say, U.S. indentureship or indentureship in Jamaica or other parts of British North America. Here, in Indian indentureship, over 1 million Indians left under long-term known contracts around the world. So they left and they were saying that they were going to sign up for a specified period of time for a specified wage. In the context of Trinidad, which is one of the main destinations, Trinidad actually has data on remittances sent via money orders, as well as all the data on entrants, so the people from India who entered into the colony. The bureaucracy around indentureship makes it possible to match these two. So if we think about other types of issues that might come up in economic history, like how can we match up people who entered the colony with data on individual remittances, I'll be able to solve that, and I'll show this in a moment. Just to give you a preview of my results, upper caste persons remitted earlier, more frequently, and they remitted higher amounts than other castes. In other words, upper castes are the ones who are more connected back to India. This remittance behavior is consistent with higher levels of altruism and or some kind of investment strategy for upper caste persons. So investing in themselves and their position in their caste group, or investing in their caste back home in India. All castes show some sort of drop off when indentureship ended. So as I mentioned, people are signing up for a specific amount of time. There's a drop off remittances after this ended. And this presents something of a puzzle. I'll talk a little bit about that institutionally and also give some ideas as to why this might happen. My contribution here is to think about, one, evidence on differential caste remittance behavior historically. We know that this occurs contemporaneously, but there's a lot of debate about caste and what it meant in, say, the 19th century. So here's an example where we can actually look back and look at differential economic behavior through remittances. Second, I'm looking at micro-level evidence on international money orders. So if we think about the first wave of globalization, we have people sending money back and forth. We have people sending money from India to Burma and Burma back to India and Canada to the UK and so on. Here I can actually look at that and actually dig down into the micro level data. There's also something in the historiography of caste. In the interest of time, I won't talk about this too much, but there is still sort of a slow simmering debate within mostly history and some other social sciences like sociology and anthropology about the creation of caste, whether or not it's a British construct or whether or not it is something that's much more long-term that gets changed or solidified under the British. So I'm happy to answer questions about that, but I won't focus too much on that in this presentation. To give a little bit of background on Indian indentureship, in 1834, the British Empire abolished slavery. And this was completed by 1838. Slaves were forced to complete a 4-year apprenticeship. And then on the 1st of August, 1838, they were completely free. What this meant was that large areas under sugar cultivation in the West Indies and Mauritius were threatened by the potential loss of the labor force. In many places, former slave owners tried to force the newly freed population to work for them. This often failed. And because sugar was such a lucrative, labor-intensive crop, they began to look at other destinations or other sources of labor. So Mauritius was first. It turned to India, which is only a several-week journey away by ship in this period of time. High population, low wages, British control, and it seems to be the perfect solution for this labor problem in a lot of these colonies. Now, because of issues related to slavery and the fear of recreating slavery, indentureship became a government department. So indentureship is run through the government in India. There are only 3 ports that are authorized as places from which people may leave to colonies around the world. There's a bilateral agreement that must be signed between India and the recipient colony, etc. So this is a large governmental undertaking. As we can see here, as I mentioned, Mauritius is the first to start. Almost 500,000 people go to Mauritius. Trinidad, which is right here in red, the 3rd colony, has the 3rd highest total, over 140,000 people. I mentioned that indenture contracts had the context had a flattened labor market. And this comes from the indentured contract itself. So there's our long terms of service of 5 years. So there's no sliding scale where people can try to negotiate time out. It's set at 5 years. Additionally, wages are set ex ante by law. So the bilateral agreement between, say, India and Trinidad requires the Trinidadian government to set a wage and to promise to enforce this wage. Bonded labor, so for instance, another form of indentureship outside of government agencies, is made illegal. So if people in the West Indies or in Mauritius want to go to India to hire their own workers outside of this framework, they cannot do so. And there are examples of the Royal Navy and the East India Company prior to its dissolution in the 1850s actually intercepting and stopping people from being smuggled from India to other locations. An important upshot of all this is that there's going to be similar treatment regardless of caste. So it's not like one caste receives a better term of service, a better wage than another caste. In Trinidad, which is the subject of my research, over 80,000 Indians had arrived by 1889, so well over half. There are very low rates of return migration, so only 13.4% per the census of 1891. So when I'm thinking later on about my data, I'm not worried so much about attrition due to people returning back to India. Additionally, free return passage was only given after 10 years in the colony. So the colony promised to pay if Indians stayed 10 years in the colony. At the same time, the colony gave major incentives to remain, including preferential land sales and re-indenture bonuses. So ways to try to induce people to stay rather than having to pay for them to go back to India. The 1880s were the peak decade of immigration, which is part of the reason why I'm studying them. It also helps to frame this because we have a large population of people coming in this period of time. In terms of the other side of this, we have the entrance on the one hand, we have the remittance mechanism on the other hand. So there were several ways for people to try to send money back. Initially, they were very clunky. They used an old-fashioned bill of exchange that had to go through banks. They had to go through banks in London, and it was very problematic. So because of this, there were new plans for British Guyana, Trinidad, and Jamaica, the big three colonies in the Western Hemisphere, to use money orders instead. So money orders had been tried already in the UK itself, and money orders were actually implemented in these colonies prior to being implemented in India. So the Immigration Department itself, which is a department in India, the Treasury of India, and later the Post Office all worked together to distribute these money orders. The idea being that these were citizens of India who were abroad, and they had the right to send money back to their friends and relatives in India. Trinidad adopted this plan of money orders in the late 1870s, and remittances were relatively low until the mid-1880s, per the aggregate reports that we have from this period of time. So when I'm focusing on the 1880s, I actually have the optimal amount of time, the optimal period of time. So high inflows from India, of new people coming in, as well as data from the 1880s on remittances right when they're really taking off. I'm going to look at several castes of interest. I have upper caste, which I'm going to break down into two different groups. We have Brahmins, who are uppermost caste, and then we have Kshatriyas. I'm going to aggregate across some different jatis here. So a lot of people are just listed as Chatri, which is an unspecified Kshatriya, Jat, Rajputs, Thakurs. So all these are going to be combined into this group. We have a middling caste, Ahirs, and then we have a lower caste, Chamars. So if you're familiar with India and its affirmative action policies today, Chamars are a scheduled caste. So they receive affirmative action in India today. And they're going to be my caste of interest, the omitted group in all of my regressions. So I'm thinking about everything relative to them. Now, Muslims are listed here as number 4. They're technically not a caste, but they are a large group. And they're an important group to study because they are so important in the migration to places like Trinidad. What I'm going to do when I'm thinking about the framework for running this, I've stripped it down for the interest of time, is try to explain short-run motivation for remittances, then compare the long-run predictions according to different remittance models or different remittance explanations. And I'll generate some testable hypotheses. So I'll just skip quickly through up until the theories of remittances. So we can think about altruism. Migrants remit money home due to some sort of direct utility benefit. So feel free to ignore the DFI DT. The idea here is that people just feel good about their friends and relatives back in India. There could be an insurance role here. So migrants remit money home in response to some sort of economic shock. And finally, there's some sort of investment. So migrants remit money perhaps for future use. So people are going to remit money for themselves or for their caste network as a whole. So all these three are going to be in the back of my mind when I'm thinking about why people might be doing this and when I try to explain the type of results that I find from the empirics. In terms of my data, I have about 14,000 individual level records for adult male entrants to Trinidad. The vast majority of people sending money back to India are men, so I'm not worried about some sort of attrition here. And I'm also capturing the entire census. So one great thing about the British and how they collected records is that they were very thorough and they collected lots and lots of different records. So as I said, there's free passage back after 10 years in the colony. So I'm going to look at 1879 because I don't want anybody who could have been eligible for that free return passage. And then I'm going to cut it off at 1888 because 1889 arrivals came too late in the year to include in the data set. I have the census of money orders from 1885 to 1889. So I'm thinking about people basically right around the time they're either starting indentureship to exiting indentureship. All the data are held at the National Archives of Trinidad and Tobago, and I've digitized them for this project. The base data set, when I think about people coming into Trinidad, is the emigration pass. So it's filled out in India, has a lot of vital information. It's issued to everyone. So I'm not worried about some sort of selection by finding people who happen to fill in this pass or whatnot. These are government documents. They're very important. So here's an example of the emigration pass. Person 41,112. His name is Kashi. He's from the ship Syria, or in the nomenclature of the British at the time, he's ex-Syria. And then I'm going to look at Remittance Folio. So these are collated from individual money orders. They contain vital information about the payee in India, so the person who's receiving it, as well as the remitter in Trinidad. And these were maintained by law for the purpose of balancing the treasury accounts. So because of this, because of its role as a government document, I'm not worried about people slipping through the cracks. So here is that same person, Kashi, 41,112. You can see it's spelled a little bit differently here, K-A-S-E-E instead, but Kashi Tigunat, who's sending money back to India. So I'm able to use this number here, this record number, to link the two, to link the people coming into Trinidad with the remittances that were sent back to India. Here's just a brief set of summary statistics. Most of the people coming in were men who were, I'm looking only at men, but they were young men. They were about average height, so about 5'4". Almost 20% were upper caste, which is actually pretty typical for indentureship as a whole. A little bit under 10% were chamars, so again, a lower caste, the caste that's going to be the caste of interest or the omitted caste in all of my regressions. I'm also looking at kin. So if we think about why somebody might send money back to India, it's because they have kin. So I have people who have no kin whatsoever, so 6%, people who have kin in Trinidad, so people who have other family members in Trinidad, that's 4%, and people who were married on departure, so people who came in with a spouse, that's 8%. So all of these are going to be important because they can affect whether or not a person's going to send a remittance. Overall, about 6% of my sample from 1879 to 1888 actually did send a remittance back. So first, I'm going to look at differences by caste. The basic question is, which castes are more likely to send remittances? So on the extensive margin, I want to think about entry into sending a remittance. So I'll run a panel logit regression where I'm thinking about a person sending a remittance at time t. So year 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, relative to my start date of 1885. So I'm thinking about whether or not a person from a particular caste is going to send this. So right here we have a vector of all the castes of interest and whether or not they're sending a remittance at time t. Again, chamar is my omitted caste. So when I run this, I'm going to split up Brahmins and Kshatriyas initially in the odd columns. I'm going to combine them in the even columns. I have district fixed effects down here. No for the first two, yes for the latter two. This is district of origin back in India, which might affect whether or not a person sends a remittance. So unsurprisingly, a person who has no kin listed whatsoever is very unlikely to send a remittance back to India. A person who's further away from India, who's been away for more years, is less likely to send a remittance back to India. But what we do see in terms of the caste groups is that Brahmins, the uppermost caste, are much more likely than Chamars to send money back to India, but Muslims, interestingly, are much less likely to send remittances back to India. When I include district fixed effects for where people are coming from in India, we see that the Brahmins are still much more likely to send, and now this combined or pooled group of upper castes is also likely to send. So the upshot here, or the takeaway here, is that Brahmins actually are more likely, even after we control for how long they've been away, whether or not they have kin, whether or not they were married on departure from India, they're still more likely to send remittances back to India than a lower caste. So in other words, Brahmins are probably much more likely to be connected back to their caste network. We can look at this also in the extensive margin. So on the extensive margin, we can, sorry, I just explained this, I apologize. We can then look at differences by caste on the intensive margin and say, do amounts differ? So I'm going to run a Tobit regression censored at the government minimum of 26 rupees, which was required in order to make this worthwhile for the government. A lot of amounts were just at 26 rupees. And so I'm going to look at the same underlying specification, except now it's a Tobit with rupees as the left-hand side variable. Here, very similarly, just to break this down again, Brahmins are much more likely to send higher amounts. Excellent. I see the 5-minute sign. Thank you. And upper castes, when I pool them together, are more likely to send. As people move further away, interestingly, they're able to send higher amounts. Again, this is conditional on sending a remittance. So this is perhaps unsurprising. People wait longer. They're able to build up a larger savings amount, and therefore they can send it back to India. If we think about the distribution, though, so this is Tobit, so we think about some sort of measure of location. Here, if we think about the entire distribution, I can compare upper castes versus not upper castes. And when I do so, I actually find that the distributions differ. So the not upper caste, so everybody except the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, are much closer to the 26 rupee minimum than the upper castes. So upper castes have the entire distribution pushed out to the right. And overall, not only on average, but sort of in the distribution itself, they're sending larger amounts back to India. So the timing of this also matters. So how soon do people send money back to India? This helps test altruism. People thinking about their family in India might try to save money quickly to send back to India. So if they're more altruistic, we should see them send money quicker. I'm going to restrict the sample here to people who just started a new indentureship contract. That way I don't get caught up in whether or not I'm missing them from the past, whether or not they might have sent a remittance before the remittance data actually start. So in terms of the timing, we see that actually there's very little difference across groups except for Muslims. So they're much more likely to send remittances later, which is kind of interesting. Also, if you're married on departure, you're less likely to send this. You send it later. So clear distinction between Muslims and non-Muslims, no clear results for other castes, and expected signs and familiar relationships. Another reason why people might send money back to India is due to insurance. So if there's some sort of economic shock in India, people might be able to send money. This could be problematic because this may not happen due to poor information between the two locations. That being said, there were information flows between them. So I can run a panel logia as well as the Tobit regression. I'm moving quickly here in the interest of time. And basically we see actually that there's not too much evidence for this. So even when we control for things like no kin listed, et cetera, when the price of rice goes up in India, people are actually less likely to send remittances is what we're seeing. We're seeing a negative association. As volatility goes up, people may send a little bit more on the intensive margin. But again, we should probably take these with a little bit of a grain of salt. So these intercontinental caste connections, Brahmins, the uppermost castes, have the strongest connections. Many other groups follow some kind of one and done rule. They send one remittance off and that's it. And Muslims, who are, again, not a caste, do seem to be the least connected back to their friends and family or religious group back in India. When we think about theories of remittances, why this may happen, altruism and some sort of inheritance or investment, both are consistent with what I'm seeing here. There's no evidence really for a story of responding to shocks back in India. I think I have just a little bit of time left, so I'll end slightly early. Thank you very much for being here again the last session. You can send questions, comments to me, and I'll pass it back to Bryan.
Thanks very much, Alexander. So I will present my discussion, and then we'll have our Q&A session. Okay, great. So very happy to be here talking about Alexander's paper. Just to quickly recap, I think that was a very clear presentation. So this part of my job is very easy. Question here I see as about how remittances from Trinidad to India varied by caste, looking at this very specific and very interesting context. In order to answer this question, Alexander has assembled some really amazing data. So he has immigration passes for about 14,000 men that entered Trinidad over a decade. In addition, he has the census of money orders over a 4-year period. Now, when I think about the results, there are two that really stand out to me. First of all, which Alex reported in the summary statistics table, was just the overall amount of remittances. So in his data, 6% of the sample remitted money to India. I think that's important for us to keep in mind. And then the main result about kind of the inter-caste variation, finding that the upper castes remitted more along the various margins that he looked at. Okay, so the overview of what I'm about to say is, first of all, I think there's a lot to like in this project. The setting is really interesting. I think that opens up some nice opportunities to get at these questions. And as you saw, and as you would expect at this type of conference, and from a researcher like Alexander, there's a really impressive collection of high quality administrative data. So I think those are really good. My comments are going to focus on what I see as some opportunities to improve and kind of advance this paper to provide a little bit more depth at some of these questions, which I see as just kind of like the normal life cycle of where this project is at, basically. So what I'm about to talk about is ways in which we might use just some really simple economic models to help us interpret the evidence that he has. And I think that will then point to some additional areas for further information about the context and perhaps some analysis of these great data that he has collected. Okay, so I want to start with just how we think about the determinants of remittance. And so we'll start by thinking about each entrant from India to Trinidad. And Alexander walked through the 3 factors that could affect the decision to remit. I think broadly you can think, first of all, of altruism. Secondly, you can think about the kind of the marginal utility of consumption of caste members in India, how much they benefit from that. Also thinking about kind of this as a monetary investment and what the return on that would be. The fourth one that I want to highlight is the opportunity cost of remitting funds. As he kind of briefly alluded to in the slides, there were some incentives for like land ownership in Trinidad, and these were long-term migrants. So when you think about what do people do if they're not sending money back, they're spending or saving the money in Trinidad itself. And so I think that opens up some interesting nuance here, because the value of that depends on how long different individuals expected to stay in Trinidad, what opportunities they face there, and so forth. So I think I would just maybe encourage you to kind of expand the scope into thinking a little bit more explicitly about the opportunities in Trinidad as well, because all of this is about kind of the relative differences between Trinidad and India. Now, the second comment, I want to think a little bit about the potential role for selective migration. There are a lot of features in this setting, such as flat wage contracts, that limit many forms of selection here. I was not convinced that all forms of potential selection were eliminated, which of course isn't a claim that Alexander made, but I think it's interesting to think about. And this just starts from the observation that we're looking at data from one location or one destination, the individuals that moved to Trinidad. And so if we think about comparing differences across castes, if there are differences in the propensity of different castes to move to Trinidad relative to other potential destinations for this type of work, that could create a lot of differences among the individuals that we see in Trinidad. So at this point, I get to punt because I have no unique knowledge of the setting or the context. So you should read this more as just kind of a request for the future to kind of fill in the context here and help us understand whether or not we should worry about differences in, the share of, say, Brahmins that move to Trinidad relative to individuals from other castes. And that can help us think about differences in their wealth, in their degree of altruism, the potential connections that they might have. The third comment that I want to think about is from the perspective of castes back in India, when we think about what kind of social pressure they might exert on the individuals that moved. So Trinidad was, as I recall, I think the fourth largest destination over kind of a longer time period. In the 1880s, I'm not sure where exactly Trinidad stacked up, but it's important to recognize that there were other destinations to which these types of workers moved. And as you think about this from the caste standpoint, the distribution of the migrants across destinations could shape expectations about what individuals to each destination would do. And so I understood that kind of within Trinidad, there were flat wage contracts. It was less clear to me that across these different destinations, wage contracts or working conditions or costs of living were similar. And so if you think about this from the caste perspective, the kind of whole portfolio of destinations could shape these. And so I think the kind of the bottom line for me is that with all of these things, the really good news, I think, is that you can address a lot of these issues and questions by telling us more about the context. And also, if you have these immigration passes for destinations besides Trinidad, then it becomes, I think, very easy to kind of provide some more analysis and help us better understand where this evidence lies. I think at the end of the day, a paper focusing on this India to Trinidad connection is a really interesting one, just hoping for more kind of background to put that in context. But it's a great paper, a great project, and I was happy to be able to think about it. So thank you, Alexander. Great. Okay, so we have time for questions. We'll do the same thing, start with folks in the room. If you have a question, I'll ask you to step on up to the microphone here, and then folks on Zoom, we will go to you next. Alexander, we'll give you like the last 5 minutes to respond to anything that might come up. Okay, any questions from folks in the room? Any questions from folks on Zoom? Okay, Alexander, the floor is yours. Please take it away.
Can I ask a question, actually?
I think Suresh is... Go ahead, Suresh.
So one thought is to look at the, you could use the shocks to the sugar tariff in the US as potentially things that change the sugar price, which is generally pretty flat, if I recall, in this period, but there are some movements maybe. And that would then be interesting also if there's a zero on that, either indicating there's no pass through to wages or there is, and some of it's getting sent back to remittances. The other sort of thought I had just on this, following up on Bryan's, is I know you know about the Natal data at the same time. And so one thought is to think about the extent to which people are sending stuff back to places that also have exposure to this other migrant destination. And so I'm wondering if there's the idea is that oh, maybe this population doesn't need to send stuff back to this place because the place is also exposed, has another migrant population somewhere else. I have some other thoughts, but I could email you there.
Okay, I'll chime in. Thank you, Bryan, and thank you, Suresh. And I am very cognizant of the fact that I'm the last thing keeping everybody from finishing up their EHA. So I'm happy to move through these. And if anybody has other questions, please feel free to jump in or email me. So thank you, Bryan, for the comments. Absolutely agree with you on using some more economic theory and thinking about some of the other reasons for this. The expected duration of somebody's stay in Trinidad is a big open question. And unfortunately, there's no particularly great answer. One thing that is true is that in other colonies, so in Fiji, from my own research, people of upper caste are more likely to go back, and they go back earlier. So it is probably more consistent with, on the one hand, investment back in their caste for them, and on the flip side, for lower castes, lack of investment in their caste because they want to invest in themselves or their families in Trinidad. So I do agree with that there could be some sort of differential desire to return. Trinidad does have return migration data, but it's really, really messy compared to some of the other colonies, and it's probably just not going to be something to work with. Trinidad also had a lot of difficulty sending people back to India, so that can affect people and how they're thinking about going back. So yeah, so I completely agree with you. Big kind of black box there. I'm going to take Suresh and Bryan's points about castes across different locations and their relationship to India together. I think they dovetail nicely. So in answer partly to Suresh's comment, all these people are coming from North India. Natal has a much larger South Indian population. So at least there's something a little bit different there. But I agree with you, and I think this is also Bryan's point, that if Brahmins are going to Fiji and Trinidad, maybe we see that there's a higher number or higher amount of remittances from Fiji back instead of from Trinidad. So that is entirely possible. Unfortunately, it's not possible really to disentangle that due to issues with data. So I've traveled over the world, and as far as I can tell, these are the only money orders or remittance data left. There's some things from Jamaica from the 20th century, but that appears to be it. So unfortunately, I don't think I can make that type of direct comparison, but I am trying to disaggregate, and that I think this is more Bryan's question, whether or not a person is more likely to go, if they're from, say, a Kshatriya, are they more likely to go to Trinidad versus another location? So that I can actually say is probably not true, based on my analysis of about 50% of all the records from this period of time. So I'm not worried about differential sorting into a colony, except the kind of general north-south distinction. So I think this mostly covers Suresh's point about shocks in the United States. I hadn't thought about shocks that could affect wages more on the sort of the bonus, overtime, extra wage, or also on the, is my employer trying to withhold my wages from me? Do I need to file a complaint? It also affects people who have ended their indentureship contracts and might be proprietors in land. So that's a good question. I haven't thought about that, some sort of Trinidad specific shock, but that's something that actually is pretty easy to look at. I think you're right that there isn't too much going on in the late 1880s in terms of changes to sugar prices or changes in the balance in terms of trade between Trinidad and other places, but that's something to check. I think that's it for all the comments. I'm happy to answer other questions. I'll turn it back to Bryan.
Great. Thank you very much, Alexander. With that, I think we can call this a wrap. Safe travels to everybody. Thanks everybody for joining us on Zoom. Appreciate it.
Thank you.